Everyone.
Hi, how are you?
Hello. Let's reconvene.
Are you back
Let's
just for
reconvene.
this?
So again, I'm Adam Millard-Ball. I'm director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation
really?
Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final panel of the day, which is honoring the legacy and the impact of our late colleague at UCLA and Professor Donald Shoup. So Donald Shoup, I think, needs no introduction, but he was someone who wasn't just a fabulous academic and wrote a 808-page book about parking, the first person, I think, in the history of the world who wrote 800 pages of book about parking. But he also had an immense impact on how planning was actually done in cities, and a critique of how we allocate urban space and what we prioritize. So whether or not you read his book, I'm sure that most of your work has been influenced by his ideas. But Donald Shoup didn't change things alone. And it was really other people who carried these ideas forward in their cities and in practice. And that is what today's panel is about, how Donald's work has translated into real action on the ground. So I'm really pleased to be joined by 5 people who have helped make that happen. Michael Manville, who is Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA and Chair of the Department of Urban Planning. Greg Spots, who is the former Director of the Seattle Department of Transportation, who brought a really progressive lens to transportation policy in that city. Someone here in LA who's been on the forefront of implementing parking reform at the street level, Ken Husting, who is Principal Transportation Engineer in the City of Los Angeles Bureau of Parking Management. And Cheng, who is CEO of Cheng Consulting, who is focused on parking policy in her professional work and also serves as a board member of the Parking Reform Network. And finally, Councilmember Nithya Raman, who represents Los Angeles' 4th District, and has really championed many of the policies on council that reflect many of Donald's core principles of rebalancing public space. And so together we're going to reflect on how parking policy has evolved, partly in light of the Olympics and Paralympics and other mega events that we are looking forward to here in Los Angeles. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with a few minutes of introductory remarks from each of the panelists, starting with Mike. And I'll have a few questions for them, and then we'll turn it back over to, I think, Adonia, right, on Slido duty. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for all being here. So I first met Don Shoup in 2001 when I was a master's student at UCLA, and I worked on and off with him for the next almost 25 years. And there's a lot you can say about Don and his influence on students, on cities, on the field of transportation research. But I guess in the couple of minutes that I have right now, I think that one thing that people don't fully appreciate about Don was the extent to which he really was an activist scholar. And I think at universities, when you hear the term activist scholar, you get a particular picture in your mind, which is of someone who sort of says that they're not that interested in research and they want to change things. And you say, well, how are we going to change things? And they say, well, first just assume a total revolution. And then we're going to rebuild everything. And of course, nothing gets done because the total revolution doesn't come. But Don was different because he didn't see that divide. He did his research with a mind to meeting the world sort of where it was. And then he could go out with his research and say, look, I've discovered this problem and I have this solution. And I understand you or people you answer to may not think it's that popular, but I also have a solution for that. And so if you just try and do these small steps, and they can be done in steps, you can gradually do a lot of good. And I think that vision of activism is the vision that actually works. You know, Don was an economist and he would say something probably like, well, we make these changes at the margin. But what it really means is that he wasn't the kind of professor who indulged in the luxury that many professors do indulge in, which is to sit back and say, no, I think these big thoughts, right? And I think about what things could be like, and you can't bother me with your little, problems about like what most of the world thinks or wants. He really did think a lot about what most people believed. And then he incorporated that into how he analyzed problems and how he came up with solutions about it. And it's one reason why he liked teaching so much, right? Because he always insisted for most of his career to teach the big introductory economics class for every master's students. And people would come in, and I was one of them at one point, and we'd sort of glare at him. And as he recited something that we thought we were going to disagree with, and then he would slowly win us over. And you look back on it now and you realize that what he was doing was just testing out his material, right? Just being like, well, if I say this, how do they respond? If I propose this, what do they get mad about? And then he'd go back and work on it. And I think that sort of holistic, comprehensive approach to sort of doing research, but research with a mind to turning it in to action that might actually take place is something I learned a lot, working with Don about, and I think there's still probably not enough of it in universities today. So thanks.
We going down the line here?
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. I'm Greg Spotts, formerly of City of LA Bureau of Street Services, and spent the last 3 years up in Seattle, and I'm getting ready to come back. It's great to see everybody. I wanted to share a quote, page 498 of the high cost of free parking. That means I read the book. I'm serious. Juan changed me from the sidewalks panel to this panel, and then I had like a month lead time to read the entire book. People always want more parking spaces if someone else is paying for them. And it's really profound, this idea that nothing is free. It costs money to build a parking garage. It costs even more money to build parking underneath a multifamily residential building or an office building. And our limited curbside space is highly valuable public real estate that can be used for a variety of purposes, and using it for parking has an opportunity cost attached. And it's been really cool for me to get much more familiar with Shoup's ideas when I changed from LA to Seattle, because in Seattle, everything's under one roof. This is relevant to the sidewalk panel. The Seattle Department of Transportation controls the roadway, the sidewalk, the street trees, the signage, the striping, the bridges, the parking. Everything above ground. Also, it places the street lights, and it does enable someone to serve as director of the above ground infrastructure. And so it was my first time getting involved in parking policy, because we didn't have that in public works. That was LADOT. And it turns out that Seattle has a not only Shoup inspired market-based curbside parking program, but Donald Shoup was actually in contact directly with two of the council members in 2010 when the Seattle Municipal Code was redone to say that we shall price the parking so that there is 1 to 2 available parking spaces on every block face in each parking district. And so today it's really interesting, like there are 31 parking districts in Seattle, and each one has a morning, afternoon, and evening rate hourly, and those rates are adjusted 3 times a year based on like kind of machine learning from ingesting all of the parking transactions from that parking district. And so the rates can move up and down by 50 cents in each of these 3 times a year intervals. So parking rates are constantly moving up and down in 31 different districts to price it so that you can usually find 1 or 2 parking spaces. And it's interesting, in the most recent adjustment last March, rates in several districts went down. Like consumer behavior is changing much more rapidly post-COVID than previously. And this isn't just a means to keep jacking up parking prices. Parking prices sometimes go down in this market-based pricing, which is really interesting. One other thing I wanted to mention is another big part of the Shoup, suite of policies is reducing or eliminating city mandated parking minimums for various uses. And Washington State has just passed a law capping localities' ability to set parking minimums. And it says you can only have a maximum of half a space required per dwelling unit. No space is required for a dwelling unit under 1,200 square feet. And I think it's 2 spaces max for every 1,000 square feet of office space and 0 parking mandates for all affordable housing projects. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens in Washington as this regulation comes in, because it's really going to change this over provision of public parking available by real estate development.
Thank you, Greg. So I hear confession is good for the soul. So I have a confession to make. I never finished reading the entire book. So it's 800 pages. Come on. I'm still working on the Bible. So even though I'm very familiar with the policies, the ideas that are shared in the book, I am nonetheless grateful that we had free parking today over at the parking lot, but just throwing that out there. Okay, that one fell flat. So when it came to Shoup's ideas, really groundbreaking. Nobody has had such a long-lasting legacy on so many facets of parking. You could talk about people that revolutionized parking in the industry, the person that created the parking meter. But Professor Shoup touched so many areas of parking in his book and subsequent books that it was just mind-blowing. I was having conversation with colleagues before. Even if we go ahead and do everything that we want to in our career, we won't have that impact that Shoup made. I've had the pleasure of talking with Professor Shoup. He is multiple times having drinks together. He is such a humble, funny man. As if any of you read his book, you'll find those different quotes that just make you laugh. And I do have a quote I want to share, but it's not one of the funny ones. It's just because it's a little bit more personal to me. But in LA, we actually rolled into action one of his major ideas, which is demand-based parking pricing. So we did that in downtown LA, and it's called LA Express Park. And that has been so successful that we've rolled it out next to Westwood, rolled it out to Hollywood, rolled it out to Venice, and it's going to continue expanding across the city. And so what we've seen, to Greg's point, is we actually saw most of the parking rates actually lower. And we actually saw an increase in revenue. So you're going like, how could that be? It's just pricing it when there's demand, and when there's no demand, just lowering the price. So overall, the price actually went down. Now, there were a couple of concepts that we went with from Professor Shoup that were not successful. And I know that's not what people may want to hear, but it's not for a lack of a great idea. There's different reasons. So one of them was disabled placard reform. So that was one of the big things he was pushing for, to create a 2-tier system, because we know that there's a lot of disabled placard abuse and misuse in the state of California. And we did have a great panel put together, a committee came up with recommendations, but unfortunately there was lack of political will at the state level. And then the other one was parking benefit districts. Great idea. Fully support it, but unfortunately that one became a victim of the pandemic. So right when we were getting ready to roll it out, pandemic came along, no money to go ahead and share. But anyways, I want to share the quote that I have, and that is, I can't name the page, so I'm not going to show off like that. Old Pasadena was once a commercial skid row, and merchants opposed parking meters, fearing that it'd drive away the few customers who came in. But when the city offered to spend all the meter revenue in Old Pasadena, the merchants changed their minds. And this just goes to show, when the concept that people hate paying for parking, they think it's going to drive away the customers. But when you show there's a direct correlation of how you're going to benefit, that changes people's minds. And look what the transformation that took place in Old Pasadena. Commercial skid row to the thriving business district it is now. So with that, hand it over to my next colleague.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So I am from the Bay Area, but I grew up coming down to LA every Christmas and summer. It was basically, the extended family all over to, Spring Arcade. It turns out where I worked at my aunt's shop. Years later, I realized was impacted by Donald's adaptive reuse program. And now downtown LA is completely, it's completely transformed, especially the Spring Arcade area. And over the years, I've had to remind my cousins that yes, LA has transit. There is a subway. And so it's just really heartening to be down here. I created the Green Trip program, which is essentially got developers to trade off excess parking and instead offering 40 years of free transit passes, car share, bike share, more housing, more affordable housing right next to opportunity. I got to learn about Shoup as a planning commissioner in 2006, right after the book was released. I heard him speak and I'm like, that's the way to manage this human habitat, integrating economics. A big piece of what I glommed onto, thanks to getting my degree in environmental biology and management at Davis, was this idea of creating a market and educating folks and really putting a price on things, the things that we actually value, and giving folks an opportunity to express that. And so Green Trip was essentially like, an organic label for housing. And we can keep doing that in all these different ways with the transit hubs and nodes. I'm currently a consultant right now for VTA in the Bay Area. That we've adopted transit-oriented communities policy where now parking is going to be required to have a maximum or pricing in order for cities to get access to regional funding. So that's coming down the line. And while many cities have adopted, these approaches, it's still going to take a lot of time. And so I would say Shoup, the quotes I was looking through, most relevant, I feel like this one is underpricing curb parking is no fairer than giving discounts on other public services merely on the basis of chance. Everyone would be outraged, for example, if cities allocated public housing on a first come, first served basis to anyone who wanted it, even to a rich miser. Allocating curb parking by cruising is not only unfair in the sense that randomly rewards a few lucky drivers, but it also wastes time and increases traffic congestion. Curb parking is a valuable public asset, and underpricing it is fiscally, socially, and environmentally irresponsible. So I think what I love about Shoup is that he empowers us all to behave as if the greater good matters, and that when we talk about the public, it includes everyone in a community, not just those who live there, but folks who work and go to school. And so I think what I've heard today is there's a tremendous amount of interest, innovation from the mobility wallets that are being innovated. I got to sit next to Hector Gutierrez in the corner. He's gone now with the innovation office. But that mobility wallet report that UCLA, you guys just released, like all of that is a perfect place to start implementing these essentially programs that can benefit from priced parking in more creative ways. And ideally even leveraging local community groups, culture groups to brand these parking districts and do stickers and whatnot, and really opening up the region to, folks who aren't just coming for the Olympics, but people who are going to want to come down just to enjoy all of it. So tailgate parties at transit stops as a VTA consultant. I'm working to see if, in preparation for World Cup and Super Bowl, if there's interest in essentially just taking over all the transit stops and parking lots and having community tailgate parties and getting folks to expect that someday that parking at the transit station is going to go away and that folks will want to welcome people parking in their neighborhood because people understand that when you pay, you're going to get quality places and not just a ton of, tons of free parking. Even though we want it, we're starting to train folks to expect more. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on this panel. My name is Nithya. I'm the council member for the 4th District in the city of Los Angeles. And I'm really honored to speak in this space and about Professor Shoup. I had, Michael, you mentioned his willingness to engage with elected officials as part of his activist scholar mentality. And I am here to tell you that that is 100% true. I emailed him, not about parking, but about sidewalks just a few months ago. And he emailed back immediately. I emailed him through a staff member in my office, and he emailed back immediately. And then he came over to my office and talked to me about his solutions for how to fix sidewalks in Los Angeles. And I need the recording of the last session because I'm still hoping that we can implement some of his ideas. He explained all of the potential political pitfalls of what it would mean to implement various pathways to how to fix sidewalks, and offered solutions, exactly as you said, to try and overcome those political hurdles. And it was really remarkable to hear someone who really believed in improving this public good and had thought about all the potential obstacles and came to me with potential solutions for all of them. But for me, I think the thing that was really exciting as someone who read his writing when I was in planning school and loved it, was the ways in which his work challenged how a bureaucracy and planners and government sees our management of a city and of public spaces and the human experience of actually living in that city and that public space, and how he tried to bring those two together in ways that made more sense for outcomes. So my quote for today was, it's unfair to have cities where parking is free for cars and housing is expensive for people, which I feel like is such an obvious statement, so obvious that we didn't even think about it before he brought our attention to it. So embedded was it into the way in which we did our work as planners and as shapers of public spaces and regulations around housing that we never stopped to question that assumption. And once you did start to question it, it opened up ways of unlocking more housing, more desperately needed housing here in LA. And, we had a new executive directive 1 from Mayor Bass, which actually generated more units of 100% affordable housing, no public financing, entirely privately financed. And part of the reason why that 100% affordable housing was possible was because they did not mandate any parking in the new units. We're still dealing with the impacts of that because it is a program that doesn't allow for discretionary review by council members. That's another reason why it works. You can't say no to a unit. And the fact that it doesn't have parking generates huge amounts of outrage in communities. And so we have 2 big projects that are slated for places in my district that I get emails about all the time, that they generate huge amounts of opposition. But I think if we can start having more people think about the cost of parking in a human way, the way that Professor Shoup did, I actually think that is the pathway towards getting more people to support this kind of work. And so I feel like he not only opened my eyes to poor regulations and their unintended consequences, but also pathways to talking about those consequences that reminded people of why they like to live in a city and how that city could become a better place for themselves and their neighborhood.
Thank you. So I'd like to kind of cast our minds back a little bit more to the world before Donald became famous. And so how far have we come? And perhaps Mike and Ken, you can speak to this. Like, what did parking policy look like before he came along and before the high cost of free parking? And to what extent have things changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed quite a bit. I would say in academia, before Don's work started to take hold, parking was something that transportation scholars thought was a land use issue, and land use scholars thought was a transportation issue, and so then nobody studied it. And because nobody studied it, or in part because nobody studied it, parking in practice was just something that I think was carried on on sort of autopilot. That cities had these provisions in their zoning code called minimum parking requirements, and it was just generally accepted that, you know, if you were going to build an apartment building, it would be 1 space per unit. If you were going to build a restaurant, you had to have 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet of seating area or something like that. And those existed because of an even deeper seated assumption, which was that if you didn't do this, there was going to be all sorts of cars that congested the curb space. And the deeper seated assumption under that was that cities were not going to manage their curb space, right? That the curb was just going to be a total free for all. And because the curb was a total free for all, whoever got there first could park there for as long as they wanted, and you were going to have congestion. And I think what Don's work did was it just pointed out, you know, you have this, I think the way he described it is there's 2 original sins. There was a sin of omission, which is that cities failed to price their curbs. And so they created all this discontent. And then rather than solve that problem, they compounded it with a sin of commission, which was that they just said, well, the way we're going to solve this is actually anybody who wants to build anything has to build a ton of parking first. And the result, well, I mean, you go outside, right? I mean, there's a reason Los Angeles looks the way it does. And there's a reason Los Angeles doesn't look like San Francisco, that it doesn't look like Boston or even, you know, the downtown of a Midwestern city or something like that. It's because we really bought into the idea that no one should ever build anything without first providing a ton of on-street parking. And so by the time Don arrived, I mean, what he ended up doing was explaining why the landscape in Los Angeles and many other places was just so, you know, relentlessly oriented around storing empty vehicles. And so that really was the big change.
So
Continue the confession, I guess. Like, how has practice changed? Yeah.
well, you know, it's really changed because when you go to a downtown area, you just assume, well, I'm going to have to circle around. I'm going to have to try to find that parking space near where I want to go. Nobody really kind of challenged that idea, that notion of like, no, it doesn't have to be like that. It shouldn't be like that. You know, you shouldn't have to increase driver frustration. You shouldn't have to increase traffic congestion. You shouldn't have to increase vehicle emissions. There's a better way to do it. And that's with demand-based parking pricing. And so he actually brought it to the forefront, going like, we have a way to go ahead and deal with that situation. If somebody wants to pay for parking closer to that high value area, they can go ahead and pay for it. And it benefits the public. You know, if they don't want to pay for it, then they could go walk a little bit further or take a different mode of transportation, which are really the founding principles of SF Park, which was the first city, San Francisco, to do the demand-based parking pricing, and LA was second. It's really to, you know, reduce traffic congestion, improve parking availability, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So these were very foundational to how we operate now within the city of LA, within the city of San Francisco, Seattle. And so just tremendous change just because of start to look at something that we just kind of ignored and said that was just part of life. Now, something to the council member's point, about the frustrations and how we're trying to deal with the change in policy of not having parking minimums at different developments. So I kind of knew this would be an issue when we decided to get reduce or eliminate parking minimums, because I also manage the preferential parking districts. So these are high impact areas where there's already a parking problem. And so when you have a development that comes in and it has no parking on site, what do you think is going to happen? So all of a sudden there's battles taking place over at the curb. And the one thing I've learned being a parking professional, parking is very personal. So when people cannot get their parking, they start to just lose it. And so, and who hears it? Usually the council member's office or LADOT. And so, you know, we're working through that, but is it the right thing to be able to build more housing? Absolutely. But, you know, there's something that I don't know how many people are aware. In California, there's recently an assembly bill that came out, I think is AB 2712, that's actually prohibiting people in the affordable or people that have the reduced parking minimums or eliminated parking minimums. They can no longer get a preferential parking placard, a permit within that area. So it's more reinforcing that if you want to take advantage of that type of development, you really are going to have to find an alternative mode of transportation, which is a good thing. But right now we're kind of going through those growing pains.
Yeah. And I think there's a key insight, right, from Donald Shoup that you can't manage the off-street like without paying attention to the curb as well. So I mean, this was I knew that Donald had fans, and after his passing, I realized quite how many thousands there were, and it's so rare for a professor to have this community of, in his case, Shoupistas, who are now carrying on his ideas and legacy. And I hope I'm not being presumptuous, so I call you a Shoupista. But can you tell us a little more about who these Shoupistas are and who are you? How have you had an impact?
Okay, so I believe Patrick Siegman, your former colleague at Nelson Nygaard, was the first Shoupista, coined the term, and since then, you know, you were on my advisory committee to create the Green Trip program. And so we brought in all the Shoupistas. No, I don't think anybody called themselves a Shoupista at the time in 2006, 7, 8, but it was building. And so there's since a Facebook group with, I believe, over 6,000 Shoupistas all over the world. And also the more professionalized Shoupistas, I would call, are the Parking Reform Network folks, the Shoup peeps, maybe a little shorter, but we're now almost 600 people growing. Please join us. There's a members only Slack channel. And you know, if you haven't, raise your hand if you've used Slack. Raise your hand. Okay. Wow. Lots y'all. Okay. So this is the secret sauce behind the Yimbys, and the PRN has also borrowed this technique, and folks are actively organizing 24 hours talks, have folks from all over the planet. It's very humbling. It's a whole different world, I'd say, than before the book was published.
So Councilmember Raman, are there Shoupistas in city government? And I guess more generally, it was really touching to see how, and thank you, the city council adjourned in Donald's honor back in February. But are there changes in the city where you see these this kind of network of Shoupistas has had an influence?
Well, Ken just said he's a Shoupista. So yes, there are lots of Shoupistas in City Hall. Mehmet Barker, who works for me, is our resident Shoupista in Council District 4. He's here today and really pushing for Shoup's policies in my office and our work. And I do think there's a growing number of Shoupistas across City Hall for sure. I know that when we did the adjourning motion, I got messages from people in the building who had read him and felt strongly about the ideas that he brought forward. Yeah, absolutely. I think that his ideas are being actively implemented in City Hall. But I want to just also say that I think he's part of a broader vibe shift around how we think about what cities are meant to do and what they're meant to provide for residents and what we take for granted as something that's free versus what we pay for in a city. And I think that there have been a number of interventions. I talked about one, Executive Directive 1, which cut out the need for parking at all in new affordable housing. There's been other efforts like the Transit-Oriented Communities Program and other interventions in the city that have reduced the need for parking, that have minimized the kinds of parking requirements that we're putting into new construction. And I think a lot of the people who are doing that work don't even know that the ideas for that came from Donald Shoup. And I think that's what's really powerful about this moment, is that people are unknowing Shoupistas, even as his policies are being implemented. I keep thinking back to when I heard that LA has a mandate in its planning code for two covered parking spaces for every home, and that mandate for a covered parking spot came from the fact that they just cut and pasted the code from places where there was, snow and, inclement weather that would actually necessitate a covered parking spot more than it would here. And now kind of the same thing is happening with Shoup's ideas, that their insights and the way in which he thinks about how buildings should be built and how parking should be planned and how sidewalks should be funded, those ideas are now being cut and pasted into policies. And I think they're so powerful. But I don't know that everyone knows that they came from Shoup.
So I wanted to ask one more question before we turn it over to Slido. So if you have questions for the panel, then this is a great time to get them in on Slido. But first, I want to kind of draw some links between our earlier conversations about mega events and the Olympic and Paralympic Games and Donald's work. And partly, I think, as Mike alluded to, like we see this around, like LA, we see stadiums in vast seas or oceans of parking. But perhaps also that some of the discussions earlier about the kind of fan zones and open streets, I mean, it links to his work about, hey, if you price the curb, then you open up opportunities to use the curb and streets for that matter for other things. So perhaps, Greg, you can take a stab at this. But what do Shoup's ideas, whether about parking requirements or curb management, what do they mean as we're moving into a season of mega events? And is this a political opportunity perhaps to implement any of them?
I think there's definitely an opportunity. And actually, like in Shoup's book, he does look directly at sporting events as a case for incenting the travel mode that is most beneficial for the broader public and the city and the society. And he talked about in the book, like having a transit ticket attached to your event ticket. And we've tried that in Seattle recently, and we had really great results with it. It's interesting. The hockey fan tends to be more suburban than the soccer fan in Seattle. There's a thing called the March to the Match, where the Sounders fans like have this parade down the streets to get to the stadium. And in that way, there's actually sort of a fun and social incentive, that it's more fun to like do the March to the Match than drive and try to find a parking space and pay for it. But the hockey matches take place at the Climate Pledge Arena, and Amazon branded it Climate Pledge. And so there's an enormous sustainability program around this arena. So they came up with this idea of having a free transit ticket digitally with your hockey ticket for the Seattle Kraken. And what the travel behavior people started doing is they started like driving in from the suburbs, parking at the end of the light rail, taking light rail to downtown, and then taking our funky little monorail that was made for the World's Fair up to Seattle Center, where the Climate Pledge Arena is. And the monorail hasn't really had much of a transportation purpose. it's more like a funny thing that tourists take because there's only 2 stops. Like there's the Westlake Plaza and Seattle Center. Well, that first year with a digital transit ticket as part of your event ticket, it was the highest ridership of the monorail in like 20 years. So our suburban hockey fans started taking light rail to monorail. And there's some studies that say that people spend twice as much when they arrive any other way than by their own automobile when they go to an event. They spend money in the community. They tend to stick around. When you drive to the event, you're agitated, like, oh my God, the traffic, the parking, how am I going to get out of the parking? Like you're dying to get out of there. And when you take a transit or walk or bike to an event, you're more likely to hang out and spend time and money there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to create financial and other types of social incentives to get some different kinds of mode share for the games venues.
The Supervisor Hahn earlier today was a little perhaps dubious about congestion pricing for the games, but is this a moment for parking pricing? Is this like a games legacy, or Mike or anyone or Councilmember?
Well, while we're still working out what we're going to be doing for the games, I think I have to tell you, I'm really excited to be with LA right now leading up to the games because we are looking forward to so many changes that we have not been able to do up until this upcoming event. So we're increasing parking pricing. Part of that is budget, but we were going to do it anyway. So we look forward to doing that. We're demand-based pricing for where you can park. You've heard that it's going to be a transit first games. So this is an excellent opportunity to be able to get people to show like, here's how transit actually works. Give it a try. It's going to be successful for the games. There are other alternatives compared to just driving and parking at the different facilities. There's shuttles that are going to be available, which we should continue beyond the games. There's shared parking. When we talk about efficiency of making the most efficient use of our parking lots, there's plenty of opportunities for shared parking. And I'm getting flashed that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to let Michael speak.
Yeah.
I mean, I think these suggestions are great and things that LA should do as the games come. But I also think it's worth pointing out that Don's work also explains why LA is going to have such a hard time having a car-free Olympics, right? So we're getting the Olympics in 2028 and they were just in Paris. One thing Paris never had to do was announce over and over again that it was going to have a car-free Olympics, right? Like no one in their right mind wants to drive in Paris. And people actually like to walk in Paris. Why do they like to walk in Paris? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones is that Paris has no curb cuts. Like you can walk block after block after block in Paris and never worry that you're going to walk across a driveway and someone's going to back out of it and run you over. That happens in Los Angeles every 25 feet, right? It does something to the walking experience. It does something to the walking experience when what you're walking next to is not a shop with a window in it, but a surface parking lot, right? It does something when the building you're walking next to is not 5 stories high and giving you shade, but 2 stories high, in part because you can't afford to build something taller because you've used up a bunch of your FAR and your parking spaces. Like if you design for driving with all these parking requirements, it's not just that you encourage people to drive, you make it affirmatively uncomfortable to move around in other ways. And LA can't undo that in 3 years. Like we are not going to have a car-free Olympics. You can't just take a bunch of patchwork things and lay them over a landscape that you have spent 40 years turning into a cartopia and say you're going to have a car-free Olympics. It just doesn't work. I mean, and that's an important lesson we get from Shoup too.
Well, let me turn it over to your question. So, Adonia, what do we have?
Oh, it is live. Yes. Okay, so we have a number of good questions. I want to just make sure we get them all visible to the group. Let's start with Riley O'Brien. Sam will. Okay.
And if you have a particular panelist who you'd like to direct your question to, then feel free to do that too.
Thank you. So I think mainly for the city of LA folks, but curious what everyone thinks. So city of LA, LA DOT Metro have been rolling out all these amazing bus lanes, but a lot of them are peak hour bus lanes, bus/parking lanes. So what would it take to turn those into 24/7 bus lanes in time for the Olympics?
Councilmember, would you like to take that?
Sure.
Okay.
Ken probably has more of a.
So I will be honest, I'm not really involved with the design of the bus lanes, but I know that there's a huge effort that's taking place within our department to create the bus lanes. And we are looking at them at how can we make them more than just temporary bus lanes? How can we make them more sustainable? And I think what we're really, there's multiple things we have to see. I think it goes back to trying to get people to understand we have a great transportation network. If you just give it a shot, maybe people will actually start to take transit a little bit more and get to those destinations. I know that I do not like driving to Staples or Crypto. You know, if I could find a way that I can get there taking transit and it turns out it's a great experience, it's, you know, I'm going to take transit. I'm going to continue to do that. And also we're implementing different technology as far as bus lane enforcement. So we're improving the overall bus riding experience, you know, helping people get there quicker by removing those obstacles. And so when they start to see the reliability, the comfort, how much money they're going to save, we're hoping that is going to increase the ridership and some of those temporary bus lanes will actually stay permanent.
And I just want to say we actually have a 24-hour bus lane on Sepulveda in my district. Partly because we were very excited about the potential for how that might change people's travel plans up and down that very crowded street. So I'm a big believer in making those changes where you think it's going to be really impactful. And I definitely think that making temporary changes for a big event can be a really exciting way of opening people's eyes to what positive impacts there can be for that to become a permanent change. So I think, I hear your question as a call for thinking about what that might be in terms of using these big events as opportunities to open up people's imagination locally about how they get around.
All right, for our next question, Sam, you can head over to Yu Hong Quang.
Hi, so my question is primarily for Ken, but if the other members of the panel want to chime in, that's great as well. You mentioned that there has been an interruption in the implementation of parking benefits districts in the city because of the pandemic, but you also mentioned that Express Park LA is being expanded. So are there plans to bring that back? And I guess more generally, right, like what are other ways that the city is trying to implement Donald Shoup's recommendations, and how far along are those, and what are there exciting things we can expect from this?
Oh, thank you for the question. So parking benefit districts. So we actually did come up with the rules and guidelines, which we called SPRF local return. Isn't that sexy? Special Parking Revenue Fund local return. So that's where all our parking money gets deposited. And so we were on the cusp of actually implementing it in the city of LA. And then the pandemic came. So we weren't able to fill the position. All of a sudden, SPRF, which has been kind of a feeder to our general fund, all of a sudden found itself being subsidized by the general fund, which is something that's never happened in my entire career. And I've been with the LA DOT 28 years. And so the program went away. And so, we started to get a little bit more momentum right now. And then, of course, our city is facing a huge deficit, which we're doing a number of different things, including raising parking rates, making use of demand-based parking pricing. So even though maybe right now is not the right time to bring it back, I do see parking benefit districts coming to LA, especially in areas where there has been no parking before. Say, for instance, the Arts District, that's a place that we're very much interested in metering. When some of the benefit of those meters being installed is going back to the community, they're going to be a little bit more welcoming. Now, what other things are we looking to do that are Shoup's ideas? I mentioned before, disabled placard reform. The one thing is that while we, the city of LA, have a tremendous amount of great ideas, we put together a panel made of 88 experts, ARP, and different types of government officials. We need the state. We need all the cities to band together. We need the state to be able to say, this is the right thing to help people with disabilities. There's a number of benefits in the policies that were really foundational that Shoup came up with, that brought to us. And then, of course, just looking at shared parking, how we manage our parking better. Instead of building more parking lots, I manage 111 parking facilities. We're not really expanding. If anything, the number is going down. So we have to really focus on how can we manage everything better, whether it's at the curb or it's our off-street facilities. So, and then of course, even though I'm not in planning department, but when it comes to the planning policies. So all this is just taking place in the city of LA and other cities, San Francisco, Seattle, and so many other cities. More and more I read about how parking minimums are being eliminated. And all of that is because, of Shoup's ideas. And I will admit, I'm a car guy. I have 4 cars. So now the 4 cars, one of them's a classic car, then a couple of them are my wives, but wives, not plural. Don't have multiple wives.
No judgments.
And then when it came to the city of LA, I was in charge of the capital projects. So my goal, my projects were to expand the highways, to increase traffic flow. And then I went to parking and I came in with my views of, cars. And it wasn't until Shoup's ideas were presented to me that I couldn't argue with it. The more I read his book, the more it made sense. And then I became a Shoupista. So that's how it's affecting LA.
Daniel. You pay
I have a
So-
big driveway.
We are now going to go to David Fenn.
Hi, David Fenn, City of West Hollywood. There was a story recently that parking enforcement in the city of LA was costing more than it was taking in. Is there truth to that? And if so, are reforms needed to address that? Thank you.
Increasing the costs.
Why don't you
I
start?
mean, yeah, there is definitely truth to that. And I think increasing the parking costs will actually help us address that, as well as making sure. So as part of this budget process, one of the things that I was really pushing for, and I think has been incorporated into the new budget recommendations, is that we were actually going to cut traffic enforcement staff while keeping assumptions about what that enforcement revenue was going to be coming into the city. And so we really tried to push as part of our kind of advocacy in the budget process to ensure that we kept DOT staff in place that would enable us to actually generate some of the revenue that helps us manage our public spaces, because it isn't just a punitive process. It's also about making sure that our public streets and our public spaces are regulated in ways that conform to our rules, which are, embedded in how we think about how movement around the city should happen. So hopeful that we can address that shortfall as we move forward. But I do think it's an important one.
So one thing I want to address real quickly. Yes, parking officers are not necessarily covering their costs, but that's because our parking enforcement officers are doing so many other duties. They are traffic control and parking enforcement officers. So many times, whenever there's an emergency, they go out, they're directing traffic. Whenever there's a big event, they go handle those events, inside safe operations. So many times they're being taken away from actually doing parking enforcement. They're doing less and less parking enforcement. So, while people will say, well, let's go ahead and cut them because they're costing the city more money. Well, they're doing so many other vital services that it really can't be captured just by the saying that they're not covering their costs. And also what I want to point out is we've seen the parking revenue in LA actually drop in the recent years since the pandemic. And even though the parking occupancy has been the same as pre-pandemic, the revenue's actually gone down. And so we did an in-depth analysis where we're going like, were we pricing things incorrectly? Why is it that the revenue is lower? And it's lower because we don't have as many officers going out there enforcing. So what I've had my own friends that work for the city of LA, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but they're going like, sometimes I don't even pay for parking because I know there's not going to be an officer coming around anytime soon. So that just goes to show we need the officers. They do so many different duties, but there's a direct correlation between the officers and the parking meter revenue. And of course, they improve quality of life. Nobody likes to get a parking citation, but when somebody's blocking your driveway, don't you want them there? So.
Mike?
Yeah, the last comment I'd make to this is that in a perfect world, parking enforcement would cost more than it takes in. Because the purpose of parking enforcement, like all law enforcement, is to deter rule breaking. And so if it works, people don't break the rules, and then you don't raise revenue. And one of the many reasons parking policy in American cities is so dysfunctional is that cities budget in their, for punishment revenue, which means that you need to have enforcement that's just strong enough to catch a bunch of people, but actually weak enough so that people keep breaking rules, right? So that you can then bring in money, which means that you're going to have a totally disgruntled public that most of the time knows it won't get caught. When it does get caught, gets hit with a very high ticket because that's how you hit your budget, right? And nobody's happy. And so if you want to raise money off parking, you meter it, right? You don't set up a system of Byzantine opaque rules, which is what we have, let them confuse people, let them then break those rules because they're confusing, have enforcement that's slipshod enough that 95% of the time they don't get caught, and then 5% of the time they get a $100 fine, right? That's a recipe for total dysfunction. And so in a perfect world, enforcement leads to deterrence, deterrence leads to no violation, and you don't raise any money.
I wanted to share a factoid about Seattle. There's 781,000 inhabitants of Seattle. There's 500,000 curb parking spaces, and we only charge for 12,000 of them.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty motor normative to me. I would love to charge for a lot more than that.
Yeah. We have time for one super quick question. So, Adonia.
All right, well, we're gonna return to an earlier contestant, Vicky Englert, already standing up and ready for the mic.
That was a perfect segue. From my understanding, the city of Los Angeles has parking meter zones, and outside those zones, without permission from city council, they cannot install a meter.
Right.
Those zones seem to cover a pretty small amount of our surface area. Would changing that system back to giving that jurisdiction to LADOT be a meaningful reform, and how so?
Super quick.
So, I'll go.
Super quick.
Super quick. I'd love to be able to have a little bit more latitude, so I'll say yes. But of course, we are not looking to put parking meters in front of somebody's house. So we are looking to just do it in the business districts. I always would love to have more flexibility. So I would say yes. Is that super quick enough? Okay.
Councilmember, would you like to add?
I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is that I have found that there has been incredible resistance within City Hall to reduce the discretion of individual council members over decisions like that govern kind of the use of public space, any kind of land use decision. There's just significant pushback on changes that would reduce our ability to decide where parking should be charged based on some kind of study that said if you charged for parking here, you would generate revenue and it would be good for that particular location. And I think that's part of why being a policymaker in Los Angeles tends to be fairly tough, because I think in an ideal system, that's how a city would be governed. That you wouldn't have an individual council member deciding where parking would be priced, but that market conditions around the demand for parking would determine that. And I just want to offer you also one little insight, which is preferential parking districts, which are ways in which neighborhoods can create specialized parking zones. Some council districts, generally wealthier ones, have a lot of them. Mine actually has the most, has like 45. And then there's council districts where there's absolutely almost none. And it's just a difference in terms of how council engagement and resident engagement with council members determines how parking is managed across a district.
Well, that's a great place to wrap this up. And I'm just reminded of something that, that Donald wrote, was that planners have no idea about how much parking there should be or how much it should cost. And I imagine he'd have probably said the same about council members as well, but, which is why we should leave it to developers and to the market. Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Councilmember Nithya, Raman, and Cheng, and Husting, Greg Scott, and Michael Manville. And we do have a little thank you for all of them, not just a bag, but we also have, this was Donald Shoup approved license plate holder, which says free parking isn't free. And my apologies, there's only one in the bag, so you're gonna have to choose which of your wives is going to get this bag. Or sorry, which car is going to get it. So you're gonna pass these down. So yeah. So you can pass these down. So thank you so much.